Yo, what is going on, everybody? It's Brave Guy here once again with another Frontier Signals update. So I'll try to make this one a little bit spiffy here, a little bit later than usual. But, without further ado, let's take a look at what's been going on in the last 24 hours. So it looks like the coronal hole stream has indeed started to hit us. The BZ is still holding strong, but we can see the phi angle kind of struggling to find its place. So it is, only barely hitting the more southern angle. So that is why we haven't really had too much turbulence in the KP index, as well as the fact that even though we have had the solar wind speed pick up, it is still pretty slow here actually. So it hasn't even hit 400 kilometers, but that is still going up. So we still have probably at least a couple days as this coronal hole stream hits us, because it was a pretty big one here, and it's just now leaving the more central edge here. So, like I said, that's probably going to be a couple days worth of coronal hole stream that we're going to get from all this. And going overnight here, things are probably going to continue to pick up. And, we do see the brand active region starting to come around the corner here. So when we take a look at the far side sunspots, there's a couple other regions that have cropped up here, and this one in the red is the one that we see coming around the bend. So that one does look to have some pretty strong magnetic components to it here. When we take a look at the footage here in the 171 angstroms, we can see just how big those magnetic arches are with the plasma. So it does seem to be fairly powerful, but it shouldn't really be that big of a sunspot group by the looks of it, at least. So following this coronal hole here, we could have a couple different sunspot regions in focus with some potential of eruption. We can take a look at the sunspots on the magnetogram. So we have the one here that is just now facing us, which doesn't have too much complexity to it, but definitely some flaring potential coming from that. And we can just barely see the very edge of the next one coming in. So we'll just have to wait and see what that one looks like. And it looks like we are expected to see some Aurora activity here. That tends to be a little bit more south than what we would expect if the magnetic field was at full strength. I believe at some point earlier in a video I mentioned that we could be as far as 50%, but it doesn't look like that's the case. We're actually closer to 25-30% field loss, but that is still pretty tremendous considering at around the year 2000 we had lost 5 to 10%. And then a decade after that, 2010, we had lost another 5%. So that is still speeding up, and I believe we're still awaiting the next potential acceleration from that. But that is what we're looking like in terms of space weather pretty much. So let's kind of move on there. Actually, first off, there's one more thing I wanted to show. So having some issues with the Coronagraph feed on here. It's just doesn't want to load, so I downloaded the video and can just show it here. So as we're coming out of eclipse season, we are still seeing these bright flashes happening every day on the Coronagraph feed, but right here you can really see exactly what is causing that. So normally it's just a really bright flash, almost like a seizure warning level flash. But we can really see how the Earth itself comes in and eclipses the satellite. So that is what's been causing the daily, the drops in the feed, as well as these flashes that we see on the Coronagraph. And we can also see the moon as well. So we got a double photobomb from the Earth passing by and the moon passing by. So I just thought that was pretty cool and gives a better picture on why it has been doing this. Sometimes, especially when a flare is happening right when that happens, it's kind of hard to tell whether that flash is being caused by the flare or by something else. So we can see that it is just the moon or the Earth eclipsing by. temporarily in front of the satellite. So I just thought I'd show that really quickly. But moving on here. So in terms of the earthquakes, we do see a complete downtrend on the tremor map from the Pacific Northwest. It's totally flatlined to 0, it seems. And, we still have a lot of tremors ongoing for these locations, but it seems like this stretch of the area here, at least on this, seems to be pretty quiet, even though we still have plenty of activity going on here. So I'm not exactly sure how that exactly correlates to what we could expect, but we're still waiting on the potential 6.0 that was forecasted by Dutch Sense. If these forecasts are wrong, I'm paying attention to that, so kind of tallying things up here and starting to reconcile my own kind of visualization for how these plate boundaries actually affect one another. So, I want to have a little bit more of an in-depth video kind of going over that, but I guess kind of the way I'm starting to visualize how these plate boundaries work and how the stress factors mitigate each other. And it kind of does take into effect that kind of standing wave pattern, but it's not exactly the same. So the way I'm visualizing it is, imagine this entire plate boundary and the connected plate boundaries kind of being like a bridge. So how when a bridge is being affected by a large earthquake, it kind of has this kind of wobble motion to it. That's what I'm kind of imagining when this happens. So, when we see similar sized earthquakes kind of ripple out on the same boundary, I'm kind of imagining there's like it's this kind of bridge where, say 2 parts of that bridge are kind of wobbling downward and kind of creating this trough. So the stress is affecting multiple places simultaneously, but it's not necessarily any sort of external factor making that happen. It's more like just inherently how the stress is propagating in the same plate boundary. So, like I said, I want to make a kind of standalone video for that, hopefully with some visuals with it to kind of help explain that. But that's just kind of not even necessarily a theory. I think it is more based in actual recorded, science around tectonic plates, but just a better way to visualize that, hopefully coming out here soon. But, we do have some strange activity. So there's another deep earthquake over here by Italy. So it's kind of in between Mount Etna and Mount Vesuvius, Campi Flegrei area. And let's see, I don't know if we can exactly see how deep this earthquake was. Of course, the EMSC is going to pull up. All right, so it took some hunting to find it in this dang list, but it looks like this is it here. So southern Italy, 269 kilometers depth. Not incredibly deep, but still a little bit unusual for this area. So, it's definitely kind of one of the general watch points here. So let's see, 3.5, yeah, so that's the one right there. Almost 300 kilometers deep, and we have some surrounding activity as well. So it doesn't look like we have really any stuff going on particularly by the volcanoes, but these deep earthquakes like that are something to look out for. And along with the standalone video I want to make regarding how those plate boundaries actually affect each other, it seems like really the 7.0 and greater earthquakes are the ones that have lingering effects on the surrounding region, up to months to even a year after the event. And then when you get into the 8.0 range earthquakes, that's when you can see potential activity being affected globally. Again, months up to potentially years in advance happening after the event. So just trying to put together the pieces here to try to make sense of what we're seeing. So we haven't had any major activity in the last couple weeks, actually more than that. But, we still see the usual 5s ripping across the Pacific and whatnot. So, just really keeping an eye out on the West Coast, over on Europe. And, sometimes over here in the Pacific, when something big happens or when there's more deep events than usual. But, other than that, things seem to be relatively straightforward here. We do have a couple of 5s striking over here in the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, right over here by these X's, which is precisely why I think this overlay by Dutch Sense is still useful in a lot of regards here. A lot of these X's and the D's for the deep earthquakes get struck quite often. But other than that, I haven't really seen anything else too notable happening. I don't think the volcanoes have been really much of an issue. But, the other things to mention, there has been more oil refineries going down, which is a pretty hot topic right now. Over in Australia, there was, I think, 1 or 2 oil refineries that went up in flames. And especially over there, there's not really, Australia imports a lot of their oil. So that is definitely something to keep on top of, especially if you're in that region. It seems like, at least from what I've been hearing, they only have 1 to maybe 2 months maximum of oil reserves to last over there. So, I know other areas aren't really struggling as much, but, seeing this chain reaction of oil refineries being either intentionally blown up or mysteriously catching on fire, definitely something to be aware of, as well as all the warehouse fires, the supply chain, the fuel economy. Those two things basically run right in parallel with each other. So, if we're seeing any sort of, controlled demolition of society as we know it, those are the 2 biggest factors right there. Is going to be, the oil and, of course, warehouses and other supply chains. Not to mention the Strait of Hormuz, or Muz, whatever, however you say that. It seems like Trump got in there, I guess, cleared out the Strait of Hormuz, and then now the U.S. is blockading that very strait. So, it's clown world. Can't really expect much more than that. But I think that will pretty much wrap things up for today's little update. So I hope you all enjoyed, got something out of it. Please like and subscribe for more. Share this video if you dare, and as always, I'll catch you all in the next.